It's a time to prepare your imaginary ice cream, or maybe to take out the notebooks and to start our another part of the conference with the keynote speech by architectural historian and critic Mart Kalm from Estonia. He's a professor and rector of the Estonian Academy of Arts, a member of Estonian Academy of Sciences, and one of the founders of Estonian Museum of Architecture, and obviously has a great number of other public duties and merits. However, for me, and I suppose for many colleagues in different places, Mart, first of all, is one of the most intellectual speakers and inspiring speakers on modern movement. And in my personal case, I would say he's an unofficial teacher since I met him for the first time in Tallinn in conference Koht ja Paik, place and location in 2003. So Mart Kalm will tell us about the challenges and achievements of the Baltic states in the process of building modern society during the interwar period. So, dear Mart, the floor is yours. Welcome to this conference.
Ladies and gentlemen, good morning to everybody. Lots of thanks for this invitation to be here in front of such an audience. It doesn't happen so often. And lots of thanks to Kaidas for these kind of introductory words. I'm quite hesitating today because I have prepared a totally new paper that was initiated by the organizers, commissioned by them, that I should compare the three Baltic countries. This is the topic I have never done earlier. There have been some research done some comparative research done over Baltic countries, but for example by Steven Mansbach and by Andreas Fülbert, but they are outsiders, and they are limited to the fact that they don't know of the local languages, and they have based their research on the sources in English. Partly, I have the same limitations. I know only Estonian and no Lithuanian or Latvian. But, and I can't hide that my position is not neutral, of course, because I am Estonian architecture historian. My knowledge about Estonian material is quite extensive, and my knowledge about Latvia and Lithuania is quite limited. And this research became possible thanks to the fact that during the last years there has been published enough material on Latvia and Lithuania, what has made me possible to do it, and lots of thanks to the colleagues whose works have been published in English by now. But beside that, these written sources of information, I am happy that we have had between Baltic researchers since the Soviet period quite fruitful collaboration. And for a person of my generation who has grown up behind the Iron Curtain, the class excursions destinations were mainly in Latvia and Lithuania. Contemporary Estonian class excursions mainly go to Helsinki and to Stockholm. The world has changed, but I have used to compare my country with other Baltic neighbors since my student days. So, when the large aging empires of Europe began to fall apart as a consequence of the World War I, the Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia and Lithuania, together with Finland and partly Poland, became independent from Russia. Even though Tsarist Russia in the early 20th century was no pariah in Europe, but a nation to be reckoned with, nor was it poor like the Soviet Union before its collapse. These newly independent nations, as they began to build their own economies, felt that belonging to Russia had hindered their development, and they now had an opportunity to accomplish something for themselves. This meant the building of new nation states and a democratic policy, a challenge that lay before all the newly independent European peoples who had to rapidly progress through the development that older nations had had centuries to work through. The Baltic states, though small and poor, were eager beginners and had great ambitions regarding modernization. The most obvious physical and visual manifestations of the validity of these new nations was the buildings they constructed. Architecture has a unique ability to reflect a society's social aspirations, economic capability, and cultural orientation. When the Baltic states regained their independence, as the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, to many they seemed interchangeably similar. But in 1918, their starting positions were quite different. Linguistically, Latvians and Lithuanians are close relatives because their languages belong to the Baltic branch of the Indo-European family of languages. Estonians don't understand them because the Estonian language belongs to the Finno-Ugric language group and is a close relative of Finnish. Culturally, however, Latvians and Estonians have more similarities because they share common history. The Lithuanian kingdom stood up to Christianity, whereas Estonians and Latvians, without the nation on their own, accepted Christianity when it was brought to them by the Crusaders from Germany. An upper class developed in the territory of Estonia and Latvia, known during the Middle Ages as Livonia, Livland, which comprised German-speaking noblemen, town citizens and clergy, while the local Estonians and Latvians formed the lower class and were subject to them. Because the Lithuanian aristocracy became incorporated into the Polish aristocracy, Lithuanians also primarily became peasants. In the early 16th century, a religious cleansing took place in Livonia, and as a result, Estonians and Latvians became Lutheran. Though they didn't not really take the German religion very seriously. Lithuanians, on the other hand, are Catholic even today. In the 18th century, the Baltic territories were one by one incorporated into Tsarist Russia. The Lutheran German-speaking territories became the so-called Baltic provinces, in Russian, Oststskie gubernia. Since the Middle Ages, the region's largest city has been Riga, which during the 19th and especially the early 20th century saw a real economic boom. In this city, with its mixed German, Latvian, Jewish and Russian populations, there were over 500,000 people before World War I. In the same period, Tallinn's population had only just exceeded 100,000 people, and the university town of Tartu had a population of close to 50,000. In the provincial capitals of Vilnius and Kaunas, there were over 150,000 inhabitants and close to 100,000 respectively. But in both cities, there were few Lithuanians among the predominantly Polish and Jewish populations. Though the people of Baltic states may not like to hear this, the differences between their relative starting positions as they first gained independence were determined by the concentrations of Baltic Germans living in their respective countries. The center of Baltic German world was Riga, where in 1862 a polytechnical school, Polytechnicum, was founded. In 1896 it was called the Riga Polytechnical Institute. and this name is better known. As a result, technical know-how increased greatly and many fields became professionalized. Baltic German economic entrepreneurship ensured the development of industry and infrastructure for the whole economy. Unlike the rest of Russia, with the possible exception of St. Petersburg, electricity networks, telephone connections, urban public transport, water services and sewage, bridges and road networks in the Baltic provinces were all established early. There were increasingly more Latvians and Estonians, and to a lesser extent Lithuanians and Poles, studying at the Riga Polytechnical Institute alongside local Germans. However, at the start of the 20th century, when city governments were increasingly run by the indigenous people, in regard to technical solutions, only continued to rely on German culture, operating within Russian legislation. Therefore, by independence, the city of Riga was by far the most developed region in the Baltic states, while Lithuania, politically repressed after the Polish uprisings and without universities, was not so developed. At the beginning of the 1920s, when the newly independent Baltic people started to build their nations, the extent to which they were equipped with architects, so the level of professionalization, varied. Because the Polytechnical Institute in Riga trained architects and the Riga Association of Architects had already been founded in 1879, Latvia had plenty of architects. In both Latvia and Estonia, real estate was the main way for Latvians and Estonians to increase their wealth and to rise up in social ladder. Real estate was the main way, hence many trained to become construction engineers or architects are boldly assumed their position alongside Baltic Germans. Asian Lauber, an architect of Latvian heritage who had played a central role in the construction boom in Riga in early 20th century, continued to work in independent Latvia. In spite of the disappointment felt by many Baltic Germans about the formation of the Latvian and Estonian nations, resulting in the emigration of many Germans to Germany, a number of Baltic Germans like Heinz Pielan, Paul Kampe and others remained in Latvia and some also in Estonia. The period between the two wars was a time of intense productivity for architects like Paul Spunjins, Indriks Blankenbergs, Friedrich Skujins, and the engineer Theodos Hermanovskis, who had all studied at the Riga Polytechnic Institute at the end of the Tsarist period. In independent Latvia, this school became the Faculty of Architecture at the University of Latvia, and virtually all the leading architects of the period studied there. Alexander Skliklavs, Oswald Stilmanis, Werner Swintans, and also Baltic Germans like Alfred Grünberg or Lydia Hoffmann-Grünberg. In addition, there were a number of important Latvian architects working at the time who had studied during the Tsarist period at either the St. Petersburg Academy of Art, like Ernst Stahlbergs, or the St. Petersburg Institute of Civil Engineers, like Pavel Streimanis. The first Estonian architects emerged later than in Latvia. The construction engineers who started working at the start of the century and the architects who followed them in the 1910s had predominantly studied at the Riga Polytechnical Institute and augmented their studies with a couple of years in Germany. It was mainly so that there were, during the 1905 revolution, of course students were on the streets, normal. After that it made sense to disappear. And so Herbert Johansson continued in Darmstadt, Eugen Habermann in Dresden, the Baltic German from Tallinn, Erich Jacobi in Hanover, etc. Since their designs were relatively similar, they are known in Estonian history of architecture as the Riga generation. The only exception was Karl Burman, who was we consider him as the first Estonian architect, but also as the only one who studied at the St. Petersburg Academy of Art, and he started in Tallinn while returning without diploma from St. Petersburg, and it caused a lot of problems for him later. but when he started in 1910, we consider it at the start as a start of the professional Estonian architecture. The Tallinn Technical School, Tehnikum, was founded in 1918, and its graduates included successful architects like August Volberg, Edgar Velgri, Erika Nõva, and others. Since in Estonia in the 1920s and 30s it was not possible to acquire academic training in architecture, many went to study to German-speaking technical universities in Central Europe, with state stipend and without. Alar Kotli to Danzig, nowadays Gdansk, Arnold Matteus to Karlsruhe, Elmar Loch to Darmstadt, Eugen Zacharias to Prague, German Technical University, etc. Lithuania's main site of construction was the temporary capital of Kaunas, to which increasing numbers of Lithuanians were moving. Architects in Lithuania, though they didn't actually differentiate between architects and engineers like Maria Tremaita has explained, Mikolas Songaila and Vladimiras Dubenetskis had studied at the St. Petersburg Academy of Art, Edmundas Alfonsas Frikas at the St. Petersburg Institute of Civil Engineering, and Felixas Visbavas at the Riga Polytechnical Institute. Architects from Germany, Poland, Denmark, and elsewhere also came to work in Kaunas. The training of architects began in Kaunas at the University of Lithuania in 1922, but in the 1920s many still went abroad to study. Vytautas Landsbergis and Stasis Kudokas completed their studies at the Royal School of Architecture in Rome. Vladas Švipas studied at the Bauhaus, and although the most popular of the German schools was the Berlin-Charlottenburg Technical University, some students also studied in Belgium and France. The Baltic states all faced similar tasks, and some of these were solved in a similar manner, while others required quite different solutions. Tallinn, Riga, and Kaunas were all former provincial towns and lacked the infrastructure required of capital cities. It was not until the 1930s that large-scale government buildings were built, but the new parliament was an institution without specific special requirements, with specific special requirements, and a venue was needed urgently. Lithuania never did end up building a dedicated parliament house. You used your Ministry of Justice, quite new building for temporary purpose. In Latvia, the former In Latvia, the former Neo-Renaissance building of the Livonian knighthood was modified for the Seima by agents Laube. Since the knighthood had been the administrative body of the local governing nobility, this building, where the Landtag met, was typologically the closest to a parliament building. But the Latvian steed was that they replaced above the main entrance the figure of the last master, Landmeister of Livonian order, Walter von Plettenberg, with the mythological figure, Latvian mythological figure, large places, the bear killer. In Tallinn, the Estonian knighthood building became the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and the Estonian Constituent Assembly met in 1919 in the Estonia Society House, which was the city's most modern building with an auditorium and the only building with a clearly Estonian identity. However, since it belonged to the society, it couldn't remain the permanent location for the parliament. In Tallinn, it was decided that the ruins of the medieval convent building in Toompea Castle in upper town of Tallinn, whose east wing had already been rebuilt in the 18th century to house the provincial government of Russians, was to be replaced by the building for the Riigikogu the parliament. Here you see this is the Teutonic castle. Here in the center is the ruins of Convents House. It was burned down during the February Revolution in 1917, and now they have started demolition of ruins and replacing it by Riigikogu building. At the time, the notion of hiding the new symbol of Estonian democracy in the courtyard of the stronghold of German power attracted much criticism. Since a new Estonian identity had to be created between the medieval castle of German order and the Baroque wing of the Tsarist Russia, using someone else's old architecture was not appropriate. Architects Johansson and Habermann designed a new building which was built from 1920 to 22 in expressionist manner, the most modern architectural language at the time. And even though expressionism was primarily a phenomenon of the German-speaking world, that was to be expected from architects who had undergone their training there in this atmosphere. And by the way, Herbert Johansson, the most important architect in Estonia during the interwar period, he was also the winner of the international competition in 1931 for the Kaunas Officers Club Ramove, together with a younger colleague, Elmar Lopp. Unlike Estonian researchers, Latvians and Lithuanians don't use the term expressionism, preferring to structure their research around the term Art Deco. Nevertheless, the terraced houses on Liepājas and Ropažu streets in Riga by Dreimanis, with their zigzag gables and intense colors, are reminiscent of those typical examples of expressionism. The Ausekla Street closed block with its kindergarten by Dreimanis too is similar to Viennese expressionism. More important than formal aesthetic indicators is the shift in social concerns. They follow the path typical of many Central and Northern European cities governed by social democrats, with their emphasis on community-focused building. In spite of the marked decline in the population of Riga after the World War I, there was a shortage of small apartments with modern conveniences, forcing the city government to build residential buildings at their own cost. In the 1920s, many towns in Estonia built municipal housing for poor people. In Tallinn, houses for workers were built near the city institutions like the slaughterhouse, central hospital, water treatment plant, schools and others. Construction work in the cities was also inspired by state loans, which in addition to small apartments with modern conveniences also encouraged the idea of garden city. It was only in town centers where the large residential buildings were favored, and these were built cooperatively, a new concept in Estonia. City houses and many cooperative residential buildings were designed in a traditionalist manner by Johansson, the head of the city design office created in 1923. Traditionalism in 1920s Estonia was based on the local 18th, 19th century manner used by master... Oh, sorry, I was too quick. Manner used by master builders for personages, manor diary farms, taverns and other types of buildings, which were free of decoration and had thick walls with few door and window openings under a high-hipped roof. This Tesenau-like architecture, with its inward-looking character, was a conscious attempt to avoid a grand style, but it also lacked a connection to a national Estonian peasant architecture. In Latvia, in the 1920s, at the aftermath of the neoclassicism of the early 20th century, or especially of the 1910s, was much greater, and you see that it's really for Latvians, it was not easy to overcome this construction boom of the late Tsarist period. In Lithuania, we also see very strong academist character of most of the buildings in 1920s, and at the same time in Estonia these neoclassical buildings of 1920s were quite exceptional because the scene was dominated by this Riga school traditionalists like Johanson, Habermann, Kuusik, Soans. And this Pärnu Mart building, which started the recovery of the city after the St. Petersburg clientele has disappeared after the revolution, and Pärnu found new visitors from what they attracted from Helsinki and Stockholm. And it's interesting that in this building, Siinma did only the interior architecture, and this was Adolfo Siinma, the first building in Pärnu. And the plan and the architecture was mainly done by two local Baltic German architects, and these von Wolfels. Erich was already a second generation Baltic German architect. His father Hugo was already in service time the Pärnu city architects. Both father and son were the graduates of Riga Polytechnic. So you see how different was the just first emerging Estonian architects, and they are collaborating with already second generation Baltic German local architects. These social differences then in 1920s and 30s were quite strong. This simple architecture, close what was done in Estonia, can only be seen possibly in the designs of Kunčins in his Večkulbene housing for railway workers and in Allaži church. Kunčins had an immense interest in researching Latvian farm architecture, which later resulted in quite extensive monograph, and he was also, like Artis yesterday mentioned, one of the main founders on the open-air museum in Riga. In Estonia, Jacobi, a Baltic German architect, had one of the Riga architect and one of the Riga generation with a consequently traditionalist approach, was head of the construction office at the Agricultural Association during the 1920s. Under his guidance, young architects like Volberg, Velbri and others who had studied at Tallinn Technical School started to design buildings for rural areas that acknowledged local heritage. The training at the Tallinn Technical School had a strong emphasis on pragmatism. But at the request of the Estonian National Museum, architecture students surveyed and drew old farm architecture. Since there was many students from rural background among the students at the technical school, this task taught them to value their own roots. In the 1920s, there was a land reform in all three Baltic states, during the course of which land was taken away from the existing landowners and divided up among the peasants. In Estonia and Latvia, where the reform was more drastic, the land that was divided had mostly belonged to the Baltic German nobles, and the new landowners were Estonian and Latvian peasants who had successfully fought against them in the wars of independence. In Estonia and Latvia, over 50,000 new farms were created, and all these required new buildings. And since the bank would only give a loan upon the presentation of a design, this meant that architects had to come up with large numbers of standard designs. These new farm buildings looked traditional, but in terms of comforts and sanitary conveniences, they represented a great leap forward. Though some might regard the designs as the imposed civilizing of farmers, even today one can see few farms across the Baltics were actually built according to the plan because poverty demanded certain simplifications. In the first decade of independence, the important manifestations of the modernization in architecture were of social and technical nature, but within a traditional form, within traditionalist form, which in itself was also innovative. Modernist architecture arrived in the Baltic states when the Latvian construction engineer Theodos Helmanovskis, who had until then built railways, been active in politics and published magazines, opened his own architecture office in Riga in 1926. His first apartment buildings in Maria Street, Riga, and numerous villas in both Riga and Ogre are completely devoid of historical architectural references, but have luxuriant forms and are highly decorative. It is not without cause that they are associated with Art Deco. In Baltic states, the less decorative version of modernism is usually referred to as functionalism. The first functionalist building in Estonia is generally considered to be Johanson's two-apartment house built in 1929 at Toompuiestee in Tallinn, and about which the leading architecture critic Hanno Kompus, who also studied architecture at Riga, wrote an approving article. Its title was typical throughout Europe during that decade, with or without roof. Smooth light-colored rendered walls and horizontal windows, which symbolize hygiene and abundance of light, continued to be typical of functionalism in Estonia. From the Estonian point of view, the widespread continued use of vertical windows in functionalism in Latvia and also to extent in Lithuania was surprising. The style of the building boom at the start of the century was probably so deeply entrenched that it was difficult for functionalism to take hold. But Estonian architects who started later and who didn't bear the burden of the past were able to go along with the innovations more easily. Our southern neighbors typically also articulate walls as if they are distrustful of clean, smooth surfaces. For this reason, Hermanovski's large buildings in the center of the Riga's Teika district with their flat walls and lack of eaves are unusually spare and empty in the context of functionalism in Latvia. Strong rounded forms and boldly protruding horizontally striped facades like Birkhan's Rota office block complete with print workshop and Klinklav's apartment building at Elisabeth's Street in Riga indicate that great popularity of Erich Mendelsohn. The same can be said of the villa, Tubelis villa at Dainava Street in Kaunas, designed by Visvaras, and Kutoka's apartment building at Vaidilute Street. One notices even more Art Deco style decorations on the facades in Kaunas. But in some cases you see that what I just have said can't be always true. And if you compare how similar were the solutions in Riga and in Tallinn at the same time by quite different architects, especially if you compare the plans, they are really surprising, following same logic, but quite often architecture is not a big art, but mainly construction logics. Yes, we may say that in Lithuania they were quite often very decorative, but at the same time it's admirable how functionalist some of those with quite, for example, like Dubenevsky's with background in academist architecture, were able to try in early 30s so modern buildings. In a way, it's really great in my mind. Functionalism emphasized modernity, satisfied many important aims for the young Baltic states. The innovative new language of form helped to emphasize the differences from the burden of Baltic German and Russian history. They were building a new society and a more educated one, thanks to obligatory extended education, and functionalism, which was hygienic and required little maintenance, was well suited for the architecture of schools. By positioning the classroom wing and the Sport Hall Auditorium. At right angles, many effective modern buildings were created, such as Johansson's Lendel Secondary School in Tallinn or Stulginski's Telšai Secondary School. The modernist sorry, it somehow lacked the function. Oh, good. It's interesting that again these differences in Kaunas you had to start with the universities. In Latvia and in Estonia you don't find in 20s and 30s a lot of buildings for research and universities, because in Tartu University was old and big one, even too big for the small Estonian Republic. There was no need for new buildings in Tartu. And in Riga, where the Technical Institute was reformed to the University of Latvia, again they had plenty of existing buildings already. While in Kaunas they had to start from scratch. And in some cases, like this Chemical Research Institute by Landsbergis, you see probably the longest ribbon windows in the Baltics. And it looks in this way very modern because of the windows and also the details, thanks to Vaidas who have been there inside some more than 10 years ago, I suppose. But at the same time, this is for me very exciting, that at the same time in Lithuania, so often you have this strong academist substream. You have the plan which follows the actual symmetry. Something from the academist tradition is so often underneath of the modernist facades and detailing. The modernist Klinkklaus responded quickly to the modernism of the TB sanatoria built throughout Europe in the interwar period, and through competition designed the Red Cross Tervete Sanatorium in 1930. The developing social conditions of the 1930s introduced the notion of holidays, and the sandy beaches of the Baltic Sea were perfect for vacations. It was a big social change, for example in Estonia. The city dwellers, the white-collar officials in the offices in Tallinn or in Tartu, they didn't want to spend their summer anymore at the relatives' farm making hay. They preferred to be on the beach. The people of Pärnu were convinced that in summer 1940 all the Europe would be traveling through their town on the way to Helsinki Olympic Games, which unfortunately were postponed because of the war. And in anticipation of this, built the Grand Beach Cafe by the design Olev Siinma in 1939, whose mushroom-shaped reinforced concrete balcony immediately became the symbol for the town. And of course we have the whole series of these mushroom balconies. You have in Lithuania, in Druskinikai, in post-war period also one. But in this Pärnu case, I like the idea how this mushroom works for different age groups. Young and beautiful can show themselves on the mushroom, and elderly people who are afraid of too strong sun can be in the shadow underneath of the mushroom. Pärnu, as well as Riga seaside town of Jurmala, had been popular resort towns already in the 19th century, but a grand hotel had never been built in either town. Now, in Pärnu, a functionalist beach hotel designed by Siidmaa and Soans has been built, as had the Kemeri Hotel in Jurmala, designed by Eisens Laube, which, though painted white, had neoclassical decoration. Did the hero of Latvian architecture refuse to go along with functionalism, or did this already herald the dawn of the new era with new requirements? And here we want to show you a good pair of symbolically important buildings in both countries, and we have several interpretations of both of them. But in my mind, there is one thing what unites them, and it is that in both cases, architects faced a big problem. The function of both buildings would expect a detached house, a detached, separate building, independent building on its own plot, like we have art halls in Taidehalli in Helsinki or Liljevalchs Kunsthall in Stockholm, or whatever example we can take. And also, if you take the post offices, what Mussolini asked to build, very modern ones, dispersed in Rome, all they are detached buildings. And now, in both cases, these buildings are just a building in a row, in a perimeter block. Okay, in the current photography in Tallinn, the neighbors have not been built yet. Art hall was the first one in the row. And now the architect has a problem. How to differentiate the building with symbolic value from the ordinary tenement houses or block of flats? And you see two different approaches. Okay, both are symmetrical, but again, Visparas has used this typical to Kaunas, this academist approach, where you have kind of motif of portico in the center and two pavilions of risalites. Okay, in English they don't use risalites, a German word, yeah. At the corners. But next to it, this post as something which is something very dynamic, moves fast. These streamlined corners symbolize this dynamism. And in the case of Tallinn, this ordinary tenement house has overcome with uniting the exhibition halls and the studios on upper floors together on one glazed screen, which is surrounded. We can read it so that this glazed screen is an abstract picture, which is surrounded by a passepartout. So you have a metaphor of an artwork, but it is only one possible reading. Actually, there have been some other ones as well, because in the original design, instead of these empty niches where soon were placed two quite typical figures from bronze, originally there were illuminator windows. But then it was built by the Cultural Endowment, and in the board there were also sculptors who wanted some work, and they imposed the redesigning of building, so to give a chance, an opportunity for sculptors as well. But until there were in designs these rounded windows, then my colleague Karin Hallas has offered a reading of this facade as it looks like a TV set. But to be honest, the TV sets started to look like this only 20 years later. Led by Antanas Smetona, Lithuania was already becoming more authoritarian in 1926, while in Estonia and Latvia, the coups that brought Konstantin Päts and Kailis Ulmanis to power took place in 1934. Even though in the European context these regimes were quite mild in the limitations they imposed on democracy, the task of architecture changed. Architecture now needed to demonstrate the might of the nation and the people, and so neoclassicism, with a blend of national motives, was perfectly suited to this. Political pressure in Lithuania was milder, but in Riga, they busily began arguing about how to Latvianize the overly German Old Town. Both Riga and Tallinn dreamed of the new town hall, and their most popular inspiration was Ragnar Östberg's Stockholm City Hall, what was designed already. The competition, if I remember correctly, was in 1908. But understandably, this highly romantic building with its gigantic tower was a popular example, and not only in Tallinn and Riga, but also at the competition of Amsterdam City Hall and other places, and even for the Stalinists in Tbilisi. In Riga, they managed to realize the monumental Palace of Justice by Škuins and the Ministry of Finance by Kliklavs, the same Kliklavs who started as a real functionalist in the beginning of the decade. And in Tallinn, administrative offices were built behind the Baroque Kadriorgu Palace, the residence of President Päts, what was designed by Kotli. Classical architectural motifs were also attached to the buildings much lower down in the architectural hierarchy, onto the facades of commercial and residential buildings, like Artur Skalintom's Army Economy Department Store in Riga and Elmar Lohk's Palace Hotel in Tallinn. For all three Baltic states, the architecture of the interwar period was of special significance because it bore witness to the nation states' competence and helped them endure the following period of annexation to the Soviet Union from 1940 to 41 and from 1944 to 91. We may say that probably the Latvians were the most professional, the wealthiest, and the most advanced. Probably the Estonians were most modern, but the Lithuanians, with building up Kaunas, they made the biggest achievement. This was the biggest leap forward. Irrespective of the differences in their starting positions, all three countries managed to build the infrastructure of modern society that was important and dear to the people, because for the first time they had made it themselves, and it was not the work of foreign powers. And one more comparison here. Maybe Estonians and Latvians were more closely following what was going on in Germany, both via regular visits to Germany, and subscribing German architectural press, and of course not the avant-garde reviews, but quite like a Moderne Bauformen or these more popular ones, while in Kaunas they were more original, thinking out how to blend together different influences, and they were in this sense more inventive in Kaunas. With the help of this architecture, they were able to Estonianize, Latvianize, and Lithuanianize their lands. Thanks to its positive political connotation, the architecture of the 1920s and 30s leaves a legacy that is easily embraced compared with what was built during the Soviet period. Thank you for your attention.